this video, I will deconstruct the argument made by writer Jonathan Safran Foer in his recent New York Times article, "The End of Meat is Here." I will do so by creating an argument map with Argumentful, which will look like this. The aim is to understand with more clarity what it is that the author is trying to convince us of, and whether the evidence he is using to support the main claim guides us logically to the conclusion. Although all reasons and conclusions might be correct, there must be a line of logical reasoning that moves us from the reasons to the conclusion. It's important to note the fact that I will not modify the argument made by the author in any way. Although it contains reasons which seem to hide certain implicit assumptions, these will be presented as the author intended them. The focus of this exercise is to see how independent reasons contribute to a central argument, and to realize how important it is that each reason leads us logically to the conclusion. Where this is not the case, I will make it clear. And before we start, one note on evidence. The author included plenty of evidence to support the reasons given. To save time, I have already gone through each and every material and made a note to specify what type of evidence that is, because I need to include this information in the argument map. Rather than going back and forth between the article and the argument map, I will actually use some notes which I have already made based on that article. And what we do know so far is that the central idea is already announced in the subtitle of the article, and it's over here as well. If you care about the working poor, about racial justice, and about climate change, you have to stop eating animals. And then throughout the article, the author makes 9 different points which represent the contributing reasons to support this central idea. And each of these 9 different points is further supported by independent reasons. So these are going to be our sub-conclusions. Okay, so let's start with the central idea. If you care about the working poor, about racial justice, and about climate change, you have to stop eating animals. This is going to be the conclusion of our argument. Moving on to the first supporting reason for this conclusion. We'll create this on the canvas. Coronavirus affected the working poor negatively. And this first supporting reason is further helped by 4 different elements. The first one, so creating this reason underneath. Smithfield employees and their family members account for nearly 70% of coronavirus diagnoses in Minnehaha County, which includes Sioux Falls. Let's take a look at the evidence used to back this. We'll create an evidence node called backing. I'll enter the hyperlink. This article is now searched through the database, and once it's found, I'm going to save it. As I now select this backing element, we can see that information regarding this has been populated in the properties area. And I'm going to specify that this is a publicly available dataset, which is done over here under type of evidence. Then I will link this evidence to the reason, and then the reason to the sub-conclusion. The second reason which supports the sub-conclusion. A plant in Perry, Iowa had 60% of their employees infected. Let's take a look at the evidence. I'm going to enter the hyperlink. I'm going to check here that the type of evidence has been populated, which it has. It's a publicly available dataset, so now I'll just save. And then link this backing evidence to the reason, and then the reason to further to the conclusion. Let's look at the third reason supporting this sub-conclusion. A plant in Waterloo, Iowa had 37% cases of their employees infected. And if we look at the hyperlink, this is exactly the same hyperlink as for the previous reason. So I'm going to make a connection between the backing for the previous reason to this one, and then connect back up to the subconclusion. And finally, the fourth reason supporting this subconclusion, the fact that the mental health of hog farmers due to animals being euthanized needs to be taken into consideration. And the evidence for this, I'll enter the hyperlink. The type of evidence has not been populated, so I have already checked this and I know it's a non-expert opinion. So I'll enter that and then click on save. And now I will connect the backing evidence to the reason and the reason to the subconclusion, and subconclusion to the main conclusion. Alright, so that's the first reason used by the author to support this conclusion. Moving on to the second reason. Coronavirus affected the farm animals negatively. This is further supported by two different statements, but each of those are backed by the same evidence. So I'll create here the first reason, the first statement, injecting pregnant sows to cause abortions. And the second one, euthanizing animals. And then let's enter the evidence as well. This is a private data set, and connecting it to both reasons. And then each of the reasons to the subconclusion, and the subconclusion to our central argument. The third reason supporting the central argument eating meat regularly impacts the environment. We've got three separate statements to support this. The first one. Animal agriculture recognized as leading cause of global warming. The evidence provided for this is a white paper. Entering the hyperlink. Click on save. And then connecting this together. The second statement to support this reason. If cows were a country, they'd be the third largest greenhouse emitter in the world. Let's enter the evidence for this as well. And now connecting it to the reason. And the third element. Each individual can contribute to reversing global warming by eating a plant-based diet. Evidence to support this. This is a publicly available dataset and also report. So I'll enter this here. So these three are the statements which support the second reason, which was eating meat regularly impacts the environment, and three different reasons were given for this. Animal agriculture recognized as leading cause of global warming. The fact that cows would be considered the third largest greenhouse emitter in the world if they were a country. And the fact that each individual can contribute to reversing global warming by eating a plant-based diet. A rather strong branch, I would say, because each of these statements is supported by evidence. And also this statement in and of itself, eating meat regularly impacts the environment, is strongly connected to the conclusion. So let's make that connection here as well. Moving on to the fourth reason. Eating meat regularly impacts the animal welfare negatively. And we have got two different elements to support this. The first one, chickens and turkeys have been so genetically modified that they live in pain, obese, and cannot reproduce without artificial insemination. Let's include the backing evidence. And then connecting the evidence to the reason and up to the subconclusion. The second statement, which supports this subconclusion. Mother cows have their calves ripped from them before weaning, resulting in acute distress. The evidence for this statement is represented by a video footage which has been posted on Facebook. And here is the hyperlink. And this is a public video footage. Looking at this branch, eating meat regularly impacts the animal welfare negatively. This branch seems to be strongly supported by all these pieces of evidence which were provided by the author. However, there's probably a problem with this statement connected to the conclusion, and we'll come back to this a bit later. But for now, just take a look at what the conclusion states and what this reason states and see if you can spot the logical issue we have here. Okay, let's move on to the fifth reason. Eating meat regularly makes us vulnerable to pandemics. This is further supported by two statements. Despite the recent attention given to wet farms, factory farms, especially poultry farms, are important breeding grounds for pandemics. And the backing evidence. Connecting it to the reason and then to the subconclusion. Second statement. 3 out of 4 new or emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. The evidence for this, represented by an official document published by CDC. Connecting this to the reason, further to the subconclusion, and then let's connect the subconclusion to the conclusion as well. I would say we've got a similar logical issue here as with the previous one, between the reason provided and the conclusion. I don't see a lot of logical connection. I'm not saying this branch is untrue. It probably is, but not to support the conclusion announced by the author. The sixth reason used by the author to support his conclusion: we can live longer, healthier lives without animal protein. And this is supported by one statement, backed by two different pieces of evidence. And the statement is, people who eat diets high in animal protein are more likely to die of heart disease, diabetes, and kidney failure. The evidence that was included, the first one, which is a cohort study. And we have got a second study, an exploratory one. This is an exploratory study. I have checked this previously, so I'm going to make this change here. Okay, so these two supporting this reason. The reason supporting the subconclusion. And then connection between the reason or the subconclusion to the central idea. Again, a rather weak logical connection between the central idea and this reason. The seventh reason to support the central idea: if the factory farm system collapses, the farmers will not suffer. Two different statements used for this. The first one, ending animal farming will not cause farmers collapse, as most farming is owned by corporations. This is supported by an official document. And I'll connect this evidence to the reason. And the second statement to support the subconclusion, which has no evidence provided. Plant-based foods and sustainable farming could create many more jobs than it would end. The author doesn't provide any evidence here. It might or may not be true, but since we haven't got any evidence, it doesn't bring a lot of value. Okay, let's move on to the eighth reason, which states that moving away from meat is not elitist. And we have three different elements to support this. The first one, a vegetarian diet is $750 a year cheaper than meat-based diet, with an exploratory study to support the statement. The second statement, people of color disproportionately self-identify as vegetarians, and we've got publicly available data set to support this statement. The third statement, which hasn't got any backing included. People of color are disproportionately victims of factory farming, as the slaughterhouse employees are overwhelmingly brown and black. Unfortunately, without any evidence, this doesn't bring a lot of value. And let's move to the final reason which supports the central idea. Reason number 9, or subconclusion 9. We cannot work with factory farming corporations to improve the food system. With two different statements supporting this. The first one, factory farming is an unfair competitor who would not survive if not supported by government grants and bailouts. There is a publicly available data set provided to support this. The second statement is not supported by any evidence, and it states that factory farming is not interested in improving the food system. Actually, because as you can probably tell, this is a rather general statement. I would say this is a warrant rather than a reason. A warrant which links the reason to the sub-conclusion. And when that's the case, we're going to collect it with an AND node. So I'm going to remove this arrow from here, add an AND node, and collect these two with the AND node and then the AND node going into the sub-conclusion. Now, why this is important is because the AND node will require that both of these statements need to be true in order to bring any validity to the sub-conclusion. So if I turn on the scores right now, since this doesn't have any evidence, the validity of this is 0% reliability, which will also influence that the sub-conclusion has a 0% reliability. Okay. So now let's also connect this to the central idea. I'm going to quickly click on save. And now let's do a quick summary of every reason given and see if it links logically or not. And we'll start with the first one, and we'll compare that back to the conclusion. So the central idea or the conclusion states that if you care about the working poor, about racial justice, and about climate change, you have to stop eating animals. The first reason is talking about how the coronavirus affected the working poor negatively. So this would be connected to the racial justice, I think. In this case, I would say that this is a logical conclusion between the reason and a logical connection between the reason and the conclusion here. The second reason, coronavirus affected the farm animals negatively. While that might be true, this isn't necessarily related to the central idea. So I'm going to select the transition or the arrow between these two, and I'm going to mark it as doesn't follow logically. The third one, eating meat regularly impacts the environment, is connected to the climate change stated in the conclusion, so there seems to be a logical connection here. The fourth branch, eating meat regularly impacts the animal welfare negatively, which again might be true, but there is no connection between the central idea announced, so I will also mark this as doesn't follow logically. The fifth one, eating meat regularly makes us vulnerable to pandemics. Again, probably true. This is rather well supported with evidence, but unfortunately not really connected to the central idea, which talks about racial justice, climate change, and working poor. So this one doesn't follow logically. Another true statement that we can live longer, healthier lives without animal protein, pretty well backed by evidence, unfortunately not connected to the central idea. Again, I'm going to mark it as doesn't follow logically. If the factory farm system collapses, the farmers will not suffer. I'm guessing that the author meant for this to be connected to the racial justice, I'm guessing. Let's say that this might connect logically to the central idea of the article, but we do have a problem here that there isn't evidence provided for this branch where it mentions that plant-based foods and sustainable farming could create many more jobs than it would end. So that's an issue. Moving away from it is not elitist. Again, this can be seen as connected to the section of racial justice in the conclusion. Again, we have here a problem with missing evidence. And on the final reason, we cannot work with factory farming corporations to improve the food system. I do not see a logical connection between the central argument and this reason, so I will mark this also with doesn't follow logically. So overall, if we look at this whole argument made in the article by the author, we've got 5 reasons which do not connect logically to the conclusion, and 4 pretty strong reasons provided by the author. Overall, the central idea of this article is strongly supported by 4 contributing reasons. In my opinion, including the other 5 contributing arguments which are not logically connected to the original central idea could make the argument weaker or disorient the reader. Another alternative the writer could have taken is that of rephrasing the central idea, so that it has a logical connection to all the reasons included. In this case, the main argument should have been extended to specify that people should stop eating meat if they care about their health, animal welfare, and perhaps also social justice, next to working poor, racial justice, and climate change.